Hi, well, thanks very much.
Hi. Tell me, how did you first get involved in this important work?
So I, well, if I start right at the beginning, I suppose I became interested in men's violence against women, in violence against women as an issue through A-level sociology. So we're talking a long time ago, and that I guess fed into me doing my degree in sociology and politics, and that fed my growing interest in feminism and violence against women was part of that. And when I left university, I applied for several jobs, as you do, and I was lucky to get my first proper job. I mean, I'd had part-time jobs and stuff, obviously, up to then, working in a women's hostel, a hostel for homeless women in London. But my interests remained men's violence against women, so I applied. I was applying for jobs in women's refuges, and in 1992, I got my first job as a refuge worker with the no longer existing Westminster Women's Aid, and I haven't left the specialist sector since.
Excellent. So plenty of experience, and you must have helped a lot of women along the way.
Yeah, yeah, I have. I mean, it's that experience has changed over the years. So I no longer do frontline work, but I did that. I was a postal worker, then a refuge worker for years, and then I was a refuge manager, actually based in the refuge. So that really, that and personal experience gives me the practical understanding, of what women are dealing with, and I think that there are some brilliant women who've never actually worked in refuges or never actually been subject to men's violence who work in the sector. But I think if you've actually done the frontline work, working with women and listening to women and understanding women's needs, it really informs the way that you work, or can really inform the way that you work later on when you're managing or directing an organization and setting policy.
Yeah, you've seen how people relate to each
Yeah,
other.
yeah, and I know what what it's like for women who take their first steps inside a refuge, and if you've not seen that, you you may have a very different idea about what women the position that women are in when they're taking that. And it's a really drastic step to leave everything that your home, which you could have been building for years, to walk away from that and just say that it's got to the stage where now I recognize that I am so unsafe or so at risk psychologically as well as physically that I have to leave all that I've worked for and move into nothing, move into the great unknown. And I
Yeah,
think actually having it, worked with that, it gives you a greater appreciation of what women are facing.
it's frequently asked. I see it all the time on Twitter and hear it on the news. Why don't women leave? It's such a trite question.
Yeah. Women don't leave because the world is not set up to be made to make it easy for women to leave. We are still sold the stupid romantic dream of a perfect family and the perfect partner, male partner, of course, husband being the absolute pinnacle of what a woman can achieve. And so there's that long-term conditioning, but a different level as well. Often women don't leave because a man's told them quite clearly that if they do leave, that he's going to kill them. And if you look at how coercive control works in abusive relationship, when a man's control is threatened to that extent, that can be a stage where risk is increased to a woman. So for some women, actually staying in a violent relationship is a survival strategy, and that I don't think that's understood well enough. Let alone all the the pressure to believe that a home with two parents is the best thing for children, let alone the financial leap into the dark, into the unknown that a woman's having to face. There are just so many factors stacked against women leaving abusive men.
Yeah. And when's the best time to go? I know you say in one of your interviews that Christmas time they don't tend not to leave because of all, they don't want to ruin Christmas for the children. And
yeah,
and by January the phone rings off the hook.
Yeah, and that was a very clear pattern when I was working in refuge. You know, you'd have vacancies in December, which is very rare. And you knew that the closer you got to Christmas, if any woman was leaving at that point, then things were dire. Yeah, and like I said, yeah, and then come January, we got loads more referrals, and I believe that there's data from lawyers that have said that January is a upswing in terms of people contacting them for divorces as well. You know, again, it's that myth of perfect family, and people really do feel pressure. Women do feel pressure to create this magic family Christmas.
Yeah, it's part of what we're trained to do.
Yeah, it is.
Basically. Yeah. Now this book, it's a hugely important book. I heard about it. Actually, my husband saw this interview. It's in the notes that we're going to be passing around, by Janice Turner in the Times, and he cut it out and read it and said to me, "Oh, you've got to read this. Have you heard of this woman?" Yeah, yes, yes, I have, but I hadn't heard that you had this book out. So I was able to order that before it was actually put out, and it's really good book.
I can't believe, sorry, Alison, that we chatted on the train for all those hours on going to Filia, and I hadn't mentioned it, but there you go.
No, you didn't need to. This was last year. I think it was out the year before, wasn't it?
Was it November 2022 it came out, I think?
22, yeah. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, not to worry. It's well worth reading again and again because it puts women first. You know, you absolutely centre women, which is quite rare. And it gives us a handbook to help us defend women's rights, women's voices, and women's single-sex spaces. Did you decide to write it before you took your doctorate?
Or no. Was
it part of the result?
It was... no, so my doctorate, we'll maybe talk about this later, developed from my work on counting dead women and the femicide census, and I must have started that in about 2015, I think is when I started, and then I'd been interested because I was still working full time while I was doing my doctorate. I continued to be interested in the women's sector and working in the women's sector, and I think during that time the threat of the Gender Recognition Act was becoming clearer, and the threat of transgender identity ideology was becoming clearer. So I was dealing with that at work and starting to blog about some of the issues and talk about the issues around that. And then I was contacted by the publisher Polity, and they asked me to put in a proposal. Now, oh gosh, I would say that as a working class woman, the last thing I ever expected was to see my name written on the spine of a book. That just isn't something that I thought people like me would ever do. So it wouldn't really have crossed my mind that I could put a proposal in. I was quite excited actually that I had friends who'd written books. I thought that was quite a good place to be. So anyway, they asked me to put in a proposal, and that proposal was accepted. Now, I guess the biggest thing going about me was this was all happening at the time that I was finishing my PhD, and the timing couldn't have been worse. But number one, Polity asked for a short book, so that was very welcome. And number two, I'd started writing about the issues anyway, And I guess I was really motivated I wanted me to be the person that wrote the book because I didn't trust what anybody else in the sector would have said or done about it. There was such reticence to talk about the issues, and to get something that came from a really strong feminist position was really important to me. And I didn't want to trust anybody else to do it. So it was a case of, well, right, this has to be done. And I want to be the person to do it. So I made time, and basically I had 2 months to write the first draft. I set myself a target for how many words I had to get written down every day. So I got up an hour early every day, and I think I only had to bang out 500 words a day and 3,000 at a weekend, and I just wrote it until it got written. And then you spend ages going to and fro between the publisher, um, in the editing in process. So yeah, it was a ridiculous time. But also I'd handed the first draft in of my PhD, and I was waiting for my viva and the rather just finish my corrections. Anyway, I was at a convenient gap, where I just took a little break, and it was a crazy thing to do because it's absolutely a different subject from my PhD. So I was writing two sort of big pieces of work at the same time. But I'm really glad that I did it.
Yeah, yeah, because it couldn't have come from anybody else, really, could it? And certainly not one of the centres where they don't centre women.
No, exactly. And at that stage, Naya, I think, was maybe Aurora New Dawn in Portsmouth had developed policy about prioritising women, but hardly anybody else had. Hardly anybody else had. We were not only one of a few, but we were the first organisation to use the Equality Act as a basis for writing a policy that said we'll prioritise women, not using the Equality Act as a way to say men with transgender identities are allowed to use our service. And a lot of the legal advice at that time I suppose we thought it was legal advice. Looking back now, we recognise that it's advice from the trans lobby to actually, I'd say, misconstrue what the law was saying. But yeah, there was just it. Yeah, it had to be done.
And I think 2017 was your policy development, wasn't it? When you put this priority, and I think that's in one of our notes that people will be able to pick up from the chat as we go along. But how hard was it for you to produce that? How scared were you? Were you or not about?
We were quietly TERFs for a long time, and I think a lot of people in the sector are quietly TERFs. But we were scared about what that might mean, and certainly there was and there continues to be, I'd say, bullying of individuals and organisations who take a stand against transgender identity ideology. So yeah, we were quietly TERFs, and I'd been told by the board that I couldn't really say anything personally about trans stuff because, as chief exec, even though I've got had the right to a private life, people do mix up what you say individually with what the organisation's position is. So I sort of had to toe the line. And then, as I talk in the book, we were just at the point of agreeing our 5-year strategic plan with our board of trustees, and just as really it was just about to be passed, and I just said, there's a window, there's an elephant in the room, and we haven't talked about the threat to women-only services and protecting women-only services, and I am concerned that if we don't talk about that, we're complicit in the threats to those services. And I was, I guess, partly I could say lucky, but partly it's by design. The board of trustees, all but one, agreed that we were going to take this new step. I mean, actually, they all agreed that we would say protecting single-sex services is we'd identify that as one of our strategic priorities. Eventually, one board member did resign because she wasn't on board with the things that were being done. And she was a great board member, but she had a different position on that particular issue. And then so once we'd done that, I guess you set your strategic plan, but then as an organisation, you've got to deliver against that plan. So then the next step was developing a policy that gave staff the guidance about what they needed to do, and protected us as an organisation. And I just to go back to that meeting with the board of trustees, we were very clear that ultimately there was a threat, that there was the possibility that might close our organisation down, that taking that step might lead to a loss of funding. And we just, the bottom line was, right, well, if this is the hill that we're going to die on, then we're going to die on that hill, and we're going to die fighting. Somebody has to do it. And that's the position that the board took. And I am so grateful to that bunch of women for supporting me and the senior management team to develop the organisation in that way. And then it was just a matter of writing a policy, which I did a lot as a chief exec. Making sure our position in law was correct, which I believed it was, and translating it into sort of a quite short, brief document that would provide a good foundation for the way that we worked.
And how was your relationship with your funders affected by it?
So when you run violence against women in services, most of your funding is via contracts, and with it's very unusual if those contracts are outside government organisations. Now, some of those contracts to provide support to women in the community actually state you have to provide support to men, but actually we get very few referrals of men. And we had safe ways of working with men in the community. We'd never work with them in the same place as women. If a man was referred and a woman was referred at the same time, and there was the awful phrase, that they're bi-directional abuse victims. We had a conflict of interest policy, so we'd only ever work with the woman, and we'd refer the man to somewhere else. So to say that we're women only, some of our contracts did require us to work with men. And then when you're in that position, it makes no difference whether the man wears a dress or not. Where if he wants to believe that he's transgender, then we could work with that. But we weren't gonna kowtow to the belief that he's a woman, and we've never accommodated a man in the refuges, and we weren't going to accommodate men in our women's centre, and we weren't going to put men in our group work. So they were all women only, which is a roundabout way of getting back to the question. So if basically my approach was, rather than be scared of local authorities, if they started asking questions that showed that they were captured by the trans lobby, and many of them are, because they've become Stonewall champions. I wrote and complained about the language that they used, and said, by asking this question, you're making assumptions about X, Y, and Z, and that's not correct. So I guess in some ways I know I made myself unpopular. I know one funder who has actually never funded us said that she'd never given Naya a contract because of that position. But most of the others up to now have respected the position that we take, because it's a legal position. And we do say in our policy that we will treat any man who's eligible to be referred to the appropriate services, that we'll treat him with respect, and we will treat, respect his dignity, and that remains the case. So and I suppose there are one or two trusts who have said that who have declined to fund us, and you don't usually find out why. And then there have been one or two individuals who offered to start fundraising for us without knowing that policy, and then when they became aware of it, they withdrew their support, and they've every right to do that. But I would say for everyone that has done that, there's been somebody else who wanted to work with us because of that position or wanted to support us. So you're only as safe as your next contract, and we've usually got about 20 to 25 contracts ongoing at the same time to deliver various services, and they're usually for anything between 1 year and 3 years. So it's an awful sort of hamster wheel of bid writing, and you're only as safe as the last one that you won. But as yet, we're still going. I think the tide's turning as well.
Yes, and also I think 2017, when you propounded this policy, was the start of women getting, fundraising apps and that sort of thing. And do you think that might have made a difference if you had been threatened your funding?
It's quite difficult because I think it would have for a short period of time, but Naya now has a turnover of about 3 million, and we support a couple of thousand women and girls a year. It would be very difficult for us to fundraise for that money to be sustainable, and you can't offer staff secure employment contracts if you don't know that you've got the money in. So yes, in terms of some aspects of funding, we'd have been okay, but I don't think that's, unfortunately, it's not a sustainable way to run a women's organisation. In fact, I don't think the women's sector is running a sustainable way at all. This process that I talked to you about, short-term contracts, is a ridiculous way to run services, and it means people like me, chief execs across the country, and I'm a former chief exec, spend their time chasing funding rather than spending their time thinking, how can we better develop our services to meet women's needs?
Yeah, and I hadn't realised until I read your book that the process, because I remember when they were first being set up back in the 70s, women's refuges was a new thing, and it was done by women for women themselves. And then all of a sudden, it seems you turn around and now it's kind of run by the council. And I hadn't realised how that had happened. It was only in the 1990s.
Yeah, I think was it about 1997? I think that Supporting People came out, and that was one of Blair's great initiatives. And it was kind of sold to the sector as potentially a great way to protect our funding, to solidify our funding, I mean, A, it was sold that way, but B, we didn't have any choice if we wanted to get funding. So this Supporting People programme was developed, which was funding for all residential services that for homeless people of various different kinds, and women's refuges were part of that. But what it did was stop us from having grants from local authorities to having contracts with local authorities. And once local authorities had a contract, they can deliver they decide what service you have to deliver. So rather than us saying, this is what we want to do, please give us some money, they were now saying, this is what you have to do. Tell us how you can do this at the cheapest possible cost. So say, so just to put a figure out in there, say you were getting 500 grand a year to deliver 2 refuges or even 1 refuge. In the old days, you think, right, what can we do with 500 grand? How, what can we do with women? How many staff can we need? All of a sudden, you've got this 500 grand that the council's advertising, and they're saying, we want you to do X, Y, Z. Now you compete with other organisations to tell us how you can do all that at the cheapest possible price, because then part of the points you were awarded for your application were disproportionately based upon price. So you'd get much bigger organisations underbidding in order to win the contract, and then failing, they'd deliver the bare bones of what that contract said, rather than everything else that an independent women's organisation would have brought with it. And that process has continued and continued. And I genuinely think it was a great act of political robbery, and the services that were winning services developed by feminists and survivors, and I think a lot of women are both. They stopped being our services and they became the local authority services, and I'm still really, really angry about that.
Yes. So do you still own your own property, or is that owned by the council?
No. So some women's organisations do own their own property. As you can imagine, in London, that's quite rare, but some do, and if they've had those properties for years. Outside London, it's a bit less rare. But most of us lease properties from housing associations.
Right, I see. And you say 70% of the assessment goes on cost, and only 30% on quality.
In the worst cases, so some it's the opposite way around, and some it might be 80% on quality and 20% on cost. But again, the local authority, the commissioning team, have the power to decide how they're going to weight the bid. And the worst case that I've heard of was, exactly that, 70% based on the cost that you said you'd deliver.
And these people, who the commissioners from the authority, or the funders, whoever they are, what experience have they got in the sector to know what's required?
They don't necessarily have any experience. I mean, sure, you get some poachers turned gamekeepers, and I hope those people who are doing that are actually the good ones and making sure women's organisations are winning the contracts. But in some cases, you don't need any. In fact, I couldn't put this in my book, but when Naya lost one of our big contracts, I had to go see the head of commissioning about the loss of that contract, and he refused to shake my hand on the grounds that his religion didn't allow him to shake hands with a woman, have physical contact with a woman. Now, if a man has that position in regards to other professionals, women, to me, it really questions his ability to make a decision about what's in women's interests in terms of service delivery. So, yes. I mean, that is a very extreme example, but it shows that men can have absolutely zero interest in and experience of and understanding of what women's needs are.
Mm-hmm. Its perspective would be partial, as all our perspectives are partial, but not inclining towards the understanding of women's needs. Yeah.
And I think I also, you can see it's a bit of one of my soapboxes. Then you forever, your power relationship with the local authority is forever changed. And again, when we lost this contract, while we were in the commissioning period, we threatened to take the local authority for judicial review for a decision around a woman being deemed to be intentionally homeless, and we were going to support her to challenge that decision. And I got a quiet call from somebody else on the commissioning team to let me know that do I really want to be doing this at a time that the contract's being looked at? Yeah, exactly.
That would be an Equality Act offence of victimisation, wouldn't it?
Oh, I don't know about that. But again, we carried on. We did, we didn't stop supporting that woman. But you are continually reminded by the local authority that they're the ones with the power. Another example was the community-based service, the IDVA service, was told that we would be required to give identities of any perpetrators that didn't have secure immigration status, and that would be a condition of our contract. Now you might think, well, that's a great thing for you to be able to do because you can actually shop the bastard, excuse my language, but actually you've to look at it more deeply than that, because if you give women who the message that you cannot be trusted, that you'll side with immigration rather than look at their needs, then you know that those sort of messages spread very quickly. So we said that we weren't going to comply with this requirement, even though it was about perpetrators. And again, we were told by the local authority that we were possibly, risking breaching our contract with them. And actually, that particular contract wasn't renewed. So it's a constant battle, and I think it always should have been, in a way, with women's sector, and whether you're working with local government, with the council, or national government, we're supposed to be the critical friend. We're supposed to challenge. We're supposed to advocate for women. But I do think either at local level, there are women who are scared to do that because they know that their funding depends on them playing nice. But we've seen that at national level as well. And Joanna Lamont, who was a former Scottish, I think she was the leader of Labour in Scotland, and certainly a Scottish MP, said that she was really aware that the women's sector had lost their, I suppose, lost that position in Scotland of being a critical friend. But actually, that power relationship makes you an arm of government now, rather than a challenge to government. Now, I hope some women's organisations are getting better at that, but I still think that there's been a trade of a seat around the table, and women are scared of losing that seat. And it's true that the gobshites are less likely to be invited and less likely to be welcomed. But that's why some of us have to keep making noise. But it probably does mean that we stay as an outsider because of that.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? On the one hand, the mission that you want to accomplish requires that you keep stum about certain aspects of the work. Really difficult. And when I think about refugees and rape crisis centres, from my younger years, I should say, I think of them only as being single sex.
Yeah.
What percentage nowadays is mixed sex?
I'm afraid I don't know. In fact, a colleague of mine, Shona Dillon, who is the chief executive of Aurora New Dawn in Portsmouth, she's been quietly or behind the scenes lobbying women's organisations to say you need to state whether you're single sex or mixed sex, and when you say that you're women only, you need to say that whether that actually means women only. Because I think a lot are saying, so there are a lot that say that they're women's only, but they believe men can be women. And then there are some that are not saying anything, but quietly retaining women's boundaries, but they're scared of coming out into into the spotlight because they think that might be risky. So I don't believe that we actually know how many are actually women's only.
And on the one hand, those organisations might get sort of donations from women, from feminists, if they knew that they were actually women only, and they're going to forfeit those, aren't they? Because they don't know whether they're worth trusting.
Yeah, they are, but unfortunately, the money that you get in donations is usually a lot less than the contracts that you're delivering.
Of course. And do any of these, do they have female-only sessions, or are they mixed-sex sessions?
In those organisations?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you've heard about the legal case that a woman called Sarah, that's not a real name, but she's taken out in Brighton.
Sarah Surviving.
Sarah Surviving, yeah, because she was unable to access single-sex services in, I think, is it east or west of Sussex? I forget which is which.
Yeah.
So she's taken out a legal challenge on that. So that, you know, there can be trans-only services in that local authority, but there were no space, no groups available to her as a female survivor of sexual violence that were women only. So I think some organisations like NIA will only provide women only support groups. Some will say that they're mixed, and some will fib about them being mixed and say that they're women only, but they include men as women.
And I understand that there need to be some trans-only services. I get that. But at the same time, that the corollary of that is that there should be some female.
Yeah. I mean, no, most feminists, most feminists will say that anybody who's been subject to intimate partner violence, family violence, or rape and sexual violence should be able to get a support service. But men's and women's needs are different, and you know, I don't want to provide services for men. That doesn't mean I don't believe that men can be victims. Men can be victims. But it's not my specialism. It's not what I wanted NIA to do. So yeah, I'm not saying, and this, you know, the same with trans people, whether they're male or female, and trans people are either male or female, they should be able to access services, but not at the expense of women only services.
Yeah, yeah, and of course you yourself won't have expertise in dealing with people who are trans.
Yeah, no, and I guess in London we were fortunate, or we are fortunate as NIA. So there's an organisation called Gallup who specialise in LGBT services. Now, a lot of lesbians, as you will know, are excluded from services if those services are trans inclusive, if they include men who call themselves lesbian. So I think that, you know, that there's a problem with that. However, it does mean to say in London, we if we were called by a man, or a man who identifies transgender, or a gay man, we were able to refer him to somewhere to get the right and the best services for him. So I think that should be available everywhere, and it shouldn't be dependent on women's organisations to deliver that. And it shouldn't also take away funding from women's organisations, and that's part of the problem. You know, we all know that there's massive deficits in council budgets everywhere, and the easiest cuts to make are those that are not statutory services. But women's services are massively underfunded, and developing services for men, even proportionally, doesn't make sense if you're taking away funding from women's services.
Yes, yeah. Women who work in the sector and in this sort of mixed economy, shall we say, they must know that it entrenches PTSD in vulnerable clients to have males sharing their spaces, their refuges, or the counselling services, and what have you. And how do they deal? Do you know how they deal with that cognitive dissonance?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And, you know, I genuinely don't think it's been properly dealt with until my work. And I first wrote, and often when I used to blog, and I just don't seem to have the headspace for that anymore, I'd write about things that I was trying to figure out in my own head. So it might be, you know, why it's different for men or women, why men can't be feminists and stuff. And so I wrote a couple of blogs that were trying to articulate the reasons for women-only services, and then started, I guess, developed that further in my book. But there hasn't been a lot of coverage of this as an issue, or indeed interest in this as an issue from the sector. And I think it's quite interesting. So I've been invited to speak at several feminist conferences about this, whether it's a Philia conference or a RadFem conference, but I've never been asked by Women's Aid, by Safe Lives or Rape Crisis to speak at one of their conferences about the importance of women-only services, which I think is very telling.
It is telling,
and that, yeah, and that so I don't want to sound like I'm sort of crying into my tin pot, but I sort of, and I've talked about this with other women. In fact, Sex Matters did some research on that. I now feel more at home with feminist conferencing and feminist gathering than I do in the women's sector, because I just I think some women do know and some women do articulate it, but I'm going to have to blow my own trumpet here. I think my work has really developed that understanding. Although I do think, some brilliant women, of course, they knew, because it was, the second wave feminists who developed their services knew that they needed to be women only. So it was always there. But I think as things have professionalized, that feminism, that link to feminism has been lost somewhat. So I know that those women are still there, but there are others who swear blind that it's not the case, and I just genuinely don't know what's going on in their heads.
Oh, and there was I hoping you'd be able to explain it, but I think it's inexplicable.
No, I agree. They must have massive cognitive dissonance, and I hope they do, and I hope it causes them lots of problems with lack of sleep and bad conscience, because that in my opinion, that's what they deserve. And if
we'll have to keep asking the questions.
What?
We'll have to keep asking them the question.
Yeah. But the fingers go over the ears, and they just don't want to know. And you come back with an analysis and an explanation of why, but their arguments are never as coherent.
No, that's the thing. Early in the book, you give stats. In fact, there's quite a few stats there that are really, really well presented on the victims and perpetrators of sexual and domestic violence.
Yeah.
Women amounting to 74% of all victims of recorded domestic abuse related offences, 16 to 74 years. Once we're over 74, it's not an issue.
So that there has been a feminist pushback against that. There's a woman called Hannah Bowes, who is a professor. I think she's just been promoted now, or assistant professor, if that's a title, at Durham, and she did I think she did her PhD on older survivors of sexual violence, making exactly that point that older women are written out of stats, and yeah, I think that's absolutely disgusting, because we know that older women continue to be victims of intimate partner abuse, family domestic violence, and sexual violence. In fact, in the work that we've done at the femicide census, we look at that there are some risks to older women that are disproportionate compared to everyone else. Now, the obvious one is women who are killed by their sons. Shall I shut up about that till we get onto the femicide census, or shall I carry on with my older women rant?
Come on then, have a rant. So you're among friends.
So women being killed by their sons, that's obviously going to disproportionately affect older women, because it doesn't tend to be young sons, it tends to be older sons who've had difficulties in life and returned home, often because their female partners chucked them out, and the mother's the last person that is going to turn their back against them. We also see, in fact, femicide census data shows us, and this, I think this is actually quite shocking, that if you look at all women killed by men in UK, it's almost the same percentage of known victims of male fatal violence, almost the same percentage of women killed by their sons as women killed by strangers. Roughly 9% of all women killed by men that we know about killed by strangers, and roughly 9% are women killed by their sons. And I think that's a shocking statistic. And if we don't look at older women, then we're not going to see that. But also, a thing that I didn't know about until I started doing the Counting Dead Women, the femicide census, was that there seems to be a particular way of preying on older women in burglaries that takes place, and women who are older. We're talking about a small number each year, but a regular amount of number, a steady amount of number each year of older women are killed by men in the context of a robbery. Now, when I first read about that, I thought, okay, this doesn't make it right, but I could understand maybe somebody robbing somebody's house, and the woman thinks, I'm not having that, and goes to confront him. Maybe he pushes her, and maybe, because bones are more brittle, blah, blah, blah. Maybe she bangs her head, maybe she ends up dying. But that actually isn't what's happening. If you look at these killings, they're some of the most brutal killings that there are. We're talking about women beaten to death with their own walking stick till that walking stick breaks. We're talking about massive amounts of overkills and sexual violence used in those killings. In fact, there was research by a woman whose name I've forgotten now, but she'd actually looked at use of sexual violence on older women in the context of robbery, and that robbers saw rape of older women as a little free extra that they got in the context of doing the robbery. You go out to rob somebody, and where you can rape an older woman as part of the fun. And then if you think about it again, and again, most of us won't know this, there is a genre of porn called granny porn and granny rape porn. And one of the men who killed a woman, his computer was seized, and before he'd killed and raped this older woman, he'd been looking at granny rape porn on his computer. So we really do need to understand the position that older women are in, and the fact that age is no protection either way, whether we're talking young women or older women, of men's violence. Yeah, depending on what age you are, there's a different pattern in who does what to whom. But yeah, it's appalling that our national statistics have 74 as a cut-off point.
Yeah, some various points here in the chat. I'm going to call on Joanna Young to ask her question. Joanna, you made 2 points about running a refuge. I think that was when we were talking about funding, and you got another point. Are you able to speak to us with your points now, Joanna?
They were more of an observation, really, from my own experience.
Go on.
Right. Well, yeah, the first one was just that I think it was talking about supporting people, and how initially we were able to negotiate on the basis of our. Sorry, I'm actually struggling because I've just had some dentistry and I've got a really sore mouth.
Shall I read it out for you?
Yeah, please do. Please.
Okay. Your first point.
Yeah,
I'm involved in running a refuge, Karen, when supporting people came to fruition and was able to negotiate with the local Labour-run council. We got the contract because of our value for money. After years of Tory cuts, the organisation I had worked in lost the contract because the local authority could no longer afford to do this, and Generic Services got the contracts. All the expertise of over 30 years was gone. And her later point was, a lot of us feminist women who'd been involved for years have left services. I feel that for women's aid refuges, changing to hierarchical structures as a result of the Supporting People initiative removed the influence of the old school feminists who had started the various groups in the first place. Okay, Karen, have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I really agree.
Thank you.
I just think it's terrible, and I guess maybe it was a coincidence of time that that supporting people came in as women who'd been those setting up refuges were coming to a later end. No, actually, I mean, we're talking about 20 years ago, so at that stage they wouldn't have been coming to the end of their careers. But I do think as women have got older, that influence has decreased, and I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think there's massive ageism. You know, I talked about this about violence against older women, and I do think there's a sort of, you know, a special sort of misogyny that is reserved for older women. And I'm going to swear again, so if you're of a gentle persuasion, then you might not like this, but I think once women sort of fail their patriarchal fuckability test, and as we do as we get older, we become less valued, and there's an anger against us. And you know, I do think that there is a special misogyny reserved for older women, because, you know, and then you know, you get stereotypes or jokes, don't you? The meme around women getting to 50, 60 and going through the menopause, and then we don't care about what people think about us anymore, and we really will tell you what we think. So I think there's a special misogyny against us, but there is also a fear about us, because we will say things as we see them. And you know, there's we write off people as being out of touch, and I think again it's worse for women. Men expertise can be more recognized, rather than saying old age and experience brings wisdom. You know, and I guess that is used against the power of women's knowledge. I think the power of older women's knowledge.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just while we're on this topic, we've got some more points here. Greta, would you like to give your point about your theory?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, fire away.
Okay, yeah, I just had a light bulb moment recently where I was trying to fathom, why do some women, and particularly lesbians, think that it's okay to include men? And I just thought, is it because they've just not experienced the threat that someone might kill them? You know, I think unless you've actually experienced that, I can kind of understand, because I was a bit kind of naive until it happened to me. So I don't know, I would be interested to see what Karen thinks of that, really.
I agree with you, and I think I don't know if you were here at the beginning when we started talking. I talked about how I'd actually worked in refuges
Yeah.
at the start of my career, and just to make it explicit, my mum was a victim of intimate partner violence from the man she was married to from around the time of me being born till I was about 18, when she left him. So I knew that sort of visceral fear of male control, and how living with that fear and control and that violence really makes a difference. And you know, we do get some women who are survivors sometimes saying, well, I'm all right with it, a trans woman's no threat to me. But actually, to some women, seeing a man being a male presence absolutely is a threat. And two, if we look at stats on who does what to whom, we know that statistically men are more likely to be violent anyway. So I think you're right. It's a failure to empathise with women who, right, for good reason, are scared of men. It's a failure of imagination to be able to imagine why women might be like that. But it's also a failure to understand what the actual data is telling us. So you know, it's just really difficult. And yeah, I mean, lesbians. I hate that. I'm not a lesbian. I hate that my lesbian sisters are being told that to be a good woman they need to shag men or be open to the concept of shagging men, you know, men who say that they're women. I think that that's an absolutely disgusting thing to do to lesbians. It, to me, I just think it's a really it's a gross violation. That I guess that's all I can say. And I genuinely, I don't understand why some lesbians seem to think that's okay.
No, I don't either.
We've got, just while we're on questions, we'll be going on. I'll ask you some more later, but just while we're on questions, Julie, are you able to ask your question about Edinburgh? I was going to ask Karen later about comparisons with other nations in the UK, but this has come up already about Julie. Carry on.
Yes, hello. I'm from Labour Women's Declaration. So hello,
Hi.
Labour women. I
Hiya.
see lots of anger about Labour. I feel your pain. We've got conference in a couple of weeks. Lots of this stuff will be brought up. It was just a bit of a rant. It's not a question. I'm assuming most women here will be aware of the case of Ros Adams brought against Edinburgh rape crisis. And we've still got it. We were promised some kind of independent review from Rape Crisis Scotland at the end of August. I don't think we've seen anything. But to that end, about how things are organised, obviously we've got a man who's still in charge of the service. We don't know if he's on gardening leave or whatever. But what came out in that tribunal very obviously and was called out in the judgment was that the board and the staff, their extreme belief in gender ideology. I think we all saw Naomi Cunningham when she said to the Spanish-speaking woman about non-binario and non-binaria, you know, the absolute ridiculousness of this was highlighted, but there was a clear failure of governance. They had lots of board members who were very young women, who I also know were sitting on Nicola Sturgeon's National Committee for Women and Girls, who also had to recite the mantra of trans women are women. So in Scotland, we had that whole cultural thing where these young women were very empowered to call people transphobes and bigots, because this was coming all institutions from the cabinet downwards in Scotland. So you had that. So meeting these young women, it can be really weird because they are so indoctrinated. It's so extreme that they come across as being very brittle.
Yeah.
You know, so some of the older women I speak to about it who don't quite get it, you can have a conversation. Sometimes with these younger women, their whole sense of self seems so caught up in this that it's very difficult to get through to them.
Yeah. And I think to go back to what Alison said about cognitive dissonance, I think that brittleness is a protection strategy, because they know if they actually listen on some level, they must know that their position is indefensible. But so the way to not deal with that is to put the barriers down, isn't it? And I think it's also known that in Scotland, to get government funding, you had to agree to be trans inclusive, didn't you? Which is appalling.
Yes, but we still do have, I mean, I think it is noticeable, and I think it's to remember, I know we have in Glasgow and Clyde, the Rape Crisis Centre there, do provide single-sex services and are clear about saying that, you know, so I don't want to give the impression that this is just Scotland. There are still women fighting a good fight and preserving those things, and we have egregious cases and services in certain places, but there are still women doing good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know there's been fabulous resistance from women in Scotland. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that question. That's really interesting. And we watched with open mouth that case in Edinburgh, didn't we? It was outrageous. And I'm just wondering whether a judicial review against Rape Crisis Scotland for even letting this man take a job that was advertised for females only. But maybe we're out of time now. Maybe that's the problem. Another question I was going to ask you, Karen, about comparisons with other places, is overseas countries. You know, how else do Norway, Sweden, Austria, Netherlands, how do they manage things? And why has UK not yet ratified the Istanbul Convention, which is quite new?
Yeah, so when I realised you were going to be asking me about the Istanbul question, I did a quick checkup because I thought, oh, I'm sure we have just signed it.
Oh, we signed it.
The UK ratified the Istanbul question in July 2022, and we were the 37th state to do so, and that's 11 years after the Istanbul Convention was introduced. So we have.
All right. Okay. Just signed it. Okay.
Yeah, we've signed it.
But is that, it's not the same as ratifying?
No, we'd signed it initially, but we've now ratified it.
Oh, great, great.
But there is a but, because that would have happened under the Tories, as we can say, as we know by the time scale. The UK did something called reserving Section 59 of the Istanbul Convention, which is around services for migrant women, protecting the interests of migrant women. So apparently the UK has been allowed to ratify it, but recognising that migrant women are not subject to the full protections that non-migrant women are entitled to, which again is an absolute travesty, because migrant women are actually subject to additional vulnerabilities, because you're not legally entitled to the benefits that might be the only way that root out of violence. So yes, we've signed it, and let's hope that it will make a difference, and that the current government will produce strategies and laws and policies because I suppose ratifying the Istanbul Convention essentially means that you've got to develop strategies as a government to address men's violence against women, and recognise that there's a structural basis, that there's a link between sexual inequality and men's violence, which I think is a really fundamental step to addressing men's violence against women. Yes. So let's see if Labour can start to make good on that. But there does need to be continued action, and there are some brilliant women's organisations like South All Black Sisters and Latin American Women's Rights Services, who are challenging the government, were challenging the Tories, and will continue to challenge Labour on the lack of protections for migrant women. So yes. That still needs to be done. In fact, even our Domestic Abuse Act doesn't fully protect migrant women in the same way that it protects non-migrant women. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. But 11 years after the introduction of the Istanbul Convention, the UK did ratify it.
Okay, thank you. And yet, the migrant women are often brought here against their own wishes, maybe by the spouse or partner. And then when the unbelievable happens, they're not allowed any recourse to public funds.
Yeah, and they may have come actually with consent, because they consented to a marriage, perhaps to a man that they believed was going to be a good marriage, a safe marriage, a healthy marriage. They certainly weren't consenting to become a victim of domestic abuse, and they didn't, they didn't foresee that. So they need that protection, and obviously trafficked women as well, who are women who have been brought over with either lack of consent or a consent that's been coerced and based on lies. They said again, they certainly didn't sign up for what they ended up getting, and those women also deserve the full protection of the law.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk about the femicide project that you set up.
Okay.
Was it 2012?
So Counting Dead Women started in 2012, and then we myself and Clary started talking in 2013. She got in touch with me, and that's when we had the conversations that led to the femicide census. So we launched the femicide census in 2015. So yeah, Counting Dead Women. Shall I just start talking about it?
I wish you would. Yeah, tell us the difference.
So it's not a pleasant story at all. January 2012, I think it was New Year, and I was coming back from a New Year break, and I got a phone call from work. I was literally in the airport when I got this phone call, and was told that a young woman who had been to referred to NIA service, was a NIA service user, had been killed. She'd been abducted and killed, and that, you know, that was awful, awful news. But so what I did, you know, professional curiosity, as soon as I got home to my computer, I started searching for information about what had happened, because we were literally just told that by the police that she'd been killed, and didn't know anything else. And even though I've been in this sector, as we've talked about, for several decades, I was quite surprised about what I found, because I was looking for information about this one woman, but there were so many women that had been killed since Christmas, the few days previous, and I just thought, what's going on here? So to try and get my head around how many women had been killed, and at that point I was thinking since Christmas, I started making a list of their names, because that's the way that you can think, okay, the woman in Hackney is this one, the women up in Sunderland are this one, and it ended up being the case that in the first 3 days of 2012, 8 women had been killed by men. Now that's a bit of a statistical blip. It's not like that all the time, but that was sufficient to pique my interest to start me keeping this list of names. And it is just as simple as, once I started doing that, I thought, well, I'm not stopping, because even back then there was that statistic, and it's wrong, that says that every week in England and Wales, to an average of 2 women are killed by a current or former partner. But that statistic, like I said, is wrong, but it was actually quite well known. But you can say that without connecting to the horror of what you're saying. But if you start saying Sandra Jones at age 32 was killed by her son, Elizabeth Macclesfield, 89, was battered to death by her son. If you start contextualizing those 2 women a week, and start putting a name to them, and start looking at their face, I think the statistic that you can say without an emotional connection, it is lost, and you start seeing the faces of these women, and I think it makes it a lot more tangible, and so it kind of became an obsession, and still is, and I guess, and that is what my PhD ended up being about. And then Clary, who's my co-founder of the Femicide Census, she's a lawyer, and unbeknown to me, she was also trying to find the source of this 2 women a week stat, and she could find nothing to back it up. But what she did find was my scrappy little list of women's names that, you know, I was making in the back bedroom in Walthamstow at that point. And so she got in touch with me, because her idea was, you know, and my work is all well and good. In fact, she was very complimentary about it, and it was quite, you know, new and innovative. But it was, I'd say, a scrappy feminist project, and her idea was, let's produce something that is robust enough to be interrogated in court. And so that's what we started doing, and indeed that's why we're continuing. So yeah, the Counting Dead Women still goes on, because I guess the main difference between the two is Counting Dead Women, we're doing it contemporaneously. We're looking at who's in the newspaper this week, who can we find out who's being killed, and you don't always get a lot of detail about that, because then the courts, you know, that reporting restrictions come down, and so you can't do detailed statistical analysis. But the Femicide Census, we do FOIs to the police forces at the beginning every year for the year before, and then a lot of those cases have been heard, and throughout the year they are heard. So we've got quite a sophisticated database that takes lots of well, just loads of data and builds up that case. But I guess we're very strict about the criteria that we can use, and it's all justifiable and defendable. So yeah, I guess that, so we do need both, and we the two projects now work together.
Okay, it's very rare for a murder to take place, a homicide, let's say, rather than a murder, because there are different types, to take place, and for it not to be noted. In this country, we almost always know once we've got a body that such and such has taken place.
We kind of think that we do, but I think so. Two women have done work on this. I'd say one's Jane Monckton Smith, and another is Hannah Bowes, who I mentioned it about older women's sexual violence. And I think it's a quote, a misquote, but it's and how Hannah basically said, "How can you get away with murder? Kill somebody that nobody's surprised that they die." So yes. If you kill an older woman that was frail, well, you can maybe disguise that as a death to old age. There's another category of deaths that I think are well, there are several, but one is fall from heights. Now, there are a lot of women who seem to fall from height, and no man gets prosecuted by that because it's very difficult to prove that she didn't jump to a death or accidentally fall. So that's another category. There's women who have problematic substance use, and again, I think there's two issues here. I think one, society fails to value these women, and there are less likely to be people fighting their corner. But again, it's easier to disguise a death of a woman who's got problematic substance use as to one that's been a result of an accidental overdose. So and also you could disguise not just a fall from height, but any type of murder, maybe a homicide as a suicide. So I think we don't know how many people are killed, and we certainly don't know how many women are killed by men. So when we talk about the femicide census, and when we talk about counting dead women, we always say at least so many women, because we fully believe that there are many more.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have the evidence to back up your, or sometimes justifiable suspicions about what may have gone on. I understand that. Yeah, but it's still work that is interrogatable.
Yeah,
your data, and you get willing feedback from the police services, or is it like drawing teeth to get that information?
They're not all the same. So some are great and really helpful, and some do the bare minimum, and some refuse to help at all.
Well, absolutely refuse.
So the Met Police refused. Yeah, and then they fobbed us off for years, saying that they would develop an information sharing agreement with us, and then for various reasons, some our end, that didn't happen, because basically we changed the way that we were running the femicide census, so we took our eye off that ball for a while. But now the Met Police are saying that they'll publish all deaths. They'll keep a list of all that, so they don't need to, they say, respond to our FOI requests, because that information's public. But I think it's only since 2022 that they've done that, and we've dated our femicide census data back to 2009. So the picture we have for London, which has got the greatest number of murders and femicides, because by virtue of the size of the population, is probably the least accurate, because we can only report against what we find in the press, and not everything makes it to the press.
Yeah, that's quite concerning. And on the other hand, Jane is saying which police forces are great. You said some are.
That's really bad, isn't it?
Can we pick them up?
Because I couldn't tell you. Sorry.
No. Okay. Okay. Maybe discretion is the better part of this. Yeah. That they might be able to carry on being great if we don't put the names up here.
Yeah, and
Fair
we
enough.
do, you know, we have the data that I can't just look up very quickly, but we would be able to tell you which police forces have responded, but it'd take me quite a lot to do that. But we do keep all our FOI responses.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Now another point. What responses have you had to your femicide census from official bodies apart from the police? What acts of public commemoration take place on the 25th of November, for instance?
So as far as I know, on the 25th of November, the only act of commemoration are those that are organised by feminists. I don't know anything else. I've never heard of anything else.
And the local councils don't.
Yeah, chance would be a fine thing. No, yeah, no. Again, if they have, it's been the local feminists or the local women's organisations that have led to that. The only official use of our work is when Jess Phillips reads out the names of women killed by men on International Women's Day. So the government has an International Women's Day debate. It's not always on International Women's Day. It's usually the first Thursday after. But for the last 9 years, Jess Phillips has read out the list of women who've been killed by men in the previous year. So that's the nearest thing that we've got to an official recognition. And I know not everybody loves Jess. I think like all of us, she's a flawed human being, and I'm sure she'd agree with that. But that act from her means that every woman that I've recorded the name of now is recorded forever in Hansard, in our national record of Parliament. Every woman, and unfortunately, as the year goes on, usually you find a few other women. So I can't say every woman that we know about, but every woman that we know about at the point of the next International Women's Day who was killed in the year before, their names are recorded forever. And I think that is really powerful, and I'll forever be thankful for Jess, because sure, she's using my work, but she can highlight and amplify that work in a way that I never could. And it means that government knows that this is happening.
And presumably the families also, the families whose women have been killed.
Yes.
Their names are somewhere. Yeah,
so Jess and I usually get contacted every year by families who say thank you for doing that, and who for them it's a really important thing. And in fact, one of Jess's assistants, Anna, has because of the number of women who were contacting them, families, that she's set up a lobby group called Killed Women who come together to use their power as families of victims to try and lobby for change. So they come at the same problem as the femicide census does, but from a different angle and with a different range of experiences. So yeah, we can work together to try and make things better.
Just as a point, will Jess still be able to do that now she's a government minister?
I think so.
Okay.
And if she can't, I'm sure she'd be the first to say to me that she can't do it and help me find somebody else to do it.
Great. A point from Thalia here, who says at Penzance every year they do a walk and a vigil. So maybe that's something you can export, Thalia. Talk to us about it later, maybe. That sounds
like exactly what I was saying. That there are local women's organisations and feminist groups that do the work rather than official things. Yeah, it's great that the Penzance women do that. I think women in Nottingham have done it for a few years as well, and women in Wales.
Okay, I've got a question. Oh, actually, it's also from Thalia. You've got a question about how many women are raping women.
No, that was actually about the statistics stuff, really, because
Right.
I just find it impossible to. I mean, your thing's brilliant, and I think the whole patterned behaviour, and when you know, I get so frustrated with the police and you know, reading the case report, anything, and thinking how are we not doing any detective work, actually?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem difficult, and I just wonder. My question really is, I look at your data, I find it impossible. I don't really know how to FOI. I'm a counsellor, so I'm sort of inside, so I feel like I should be able to get the info, but it is impossible, whether it's from public health or from police or whatever. But is there anybody actually properly doing studies on you know, the escalation and things like that, and getting detail on how people are killed, and that whole, you know, I would think there'd be a whole section of the police funded just to look at this, but is that not the case?
So I'd say since the pandemic, the police have done what they call a domestic homicide project, and I think they've absolutely ripped off our work. And they're doing it on both sexes. In fact, they don't disaggregate their data by sex in a lot of their reports. They've got that, they can do that with the data, but they don't present it that way. And I think that happens all the time, you know, almost linked to the thing that we were talking about, women's refuges. Women do brilliant work, and then the state latches onto that idea and sort of rubs the feminist out of the work and carries on doing it. So and it makes that the work lose a lot of value. So they are supposed to be doing that. I think there have been some challenges to the police, and I wish I could give you a more accurate response than I think this is happening. But I know some police forces have been challenged to say, okay, if you want to record data by gender, declared self-gender, can you also record it by sex as well? And because some police services have said that they will do it by self-declared gender. And I know there's an academic called Alice Sullivan who's doing a lot of work on data and the importance of sex disaggregated data. So it's her work that I'd look at if you're interested in that in particular. But I think it is a big problem. I'm not sure if data is telling us that there's more female perpetrated sexual violence going on at the moment. But if data is telling us that same data isn't telling us whether those so-called females are actually females and not men who say that they're women. So yeah, I don't know, and we absolutely should know. So that I don't say that gender identity is irrelevant when it comes to data. I say let's count both, let's accurately record both, because then we'd also be able to see the level of criminality in the so-called trans-identifying population, and that would be very interesting to know. But actually, maybe for some trans people, it's in their interests that data is disguised and not available.
Thalia, you had another question earlier on about numbers, about refuges. Do you want to ask that?
I think I remember what that one was. I mean, I think what I was sort of going to ask was, on this group, it looks like there's lots of people that have experience of refuges and things, and I find that so my background's, I'm just a counsellor, so I haven't got any expertise, but I am now responsible in chairing a group for violence against women and girls, and I'm trying to be very careful, because as all councils or many councils, I can see that when I'm asking the questions like trying to find out the numbers on helplines, like what sex are the people that are calling, and of course there's no data, so
there should be.
I know if a man, well, I'm what I'm finding is like it's real struggle to get the data.
Yeah.
And I think January I haven't had a response yet, so
right.
That's my last one. But I'm just thinking, I'm quite happily put my thing in the chat, my email, but just I feel like there's lots of things you can do from within when services are being commissioned, and potentially if I knew more about things, I could ask those questions, because we have a male refuge down here, but we also have helplines where men can pick up the phone and answer the calls, and I know that some women won't want to pick up the phone.
So
And I'm
where are you? What part of the country?
Cornwall, right down the
Oh,
bottom.
right. So that's what's he called? Diana. He calls himself Diana, doesn't he? The guy who's the so-called trans advisor to the police.
Oh, I don't even know, but that would surprise me.
When a few years ago I gave evidence to the Women's Select Committee about single-sex services and the understanding in women's organisations about the provisions of the Equality Act and the ability to give single-sex services. And there were 3 of us who were questioned in that session. There was me, there was a woman from Women's Aid who was dreadful, and there was this bloke, and I do think his name's called Diana James actually, and he is the he was I think he was connected to the local women's organisation, and he was a police advisor. Now he talked nonsense throughout that, but if you Google that women's Inequality Select Committee, I think it's still available as a video, and you can still find the transcript. And because it's your local area, I definitely have a look at it, because then you'll know who you're up against.
It feels a little bit like that sometimes.
Yeah.
But thank you. Yeah, just
Right.
yeah, that's helpful.
Thanks for those questions, Daria, and I'm sure we'll pick up on those later on. You speak persuasively about women's activism as agents of change. Right at the end, towards the end of the book, page 160, that you sort of talk about the largest ever study of government responses to violence against women and girls, looked at 70 countries between 1975 and 2005, and found the most important factor influencing policy changes was feminist activism.
Yeah.
I did not know that, and I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Just for that.
Yeah.
Read your book.
Yeah. I honestly say I think that's one of my favourite pieces of research, and we really should know it. So they looked at variables, one of them was women, the sort of vibrancy of feminist activism, the number of women politicians, wealth in the country. They looked at several variables and tried to figure out which were the important ones for having feminist or women-centered policy. And as Alison said, the most important single variable was the vibrancy that was feminist activism in the country. So it was Patton and I can't remember the name.
Weldon and Hutun.
Yeah.
It's put in the chat. So
brilliant. Everybody should know that piece of work. I think it's brilliant.
I've only been able to read the abstract, which is about a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah.
But presumably you've read the whole report.
Yeah. Back when I was a PhD student, I used to be able to access journals. I can't anymore. But yeah.
We'll see if we can get hold of that, because it looks absolutely splendid.
It's fascinating.
But just that quotation was really, really interesting. So that's another reason for us never to stop being activists, isn't it? Now we have. I've got another couple of questions, and I know I've got 3 or 4 questions in the chat. What I want to know is what sort of challenge is it for you and your colleagues in getting mental health support for women after periods of domestic abuse? I've heard all sorts of contested stories about it.
I suppose it depends when you talk about mental health support, whether you're talking about statutory services and sort of medicalised mental health support, which we all know, as services are in shreds. It is one problem. Number 2, there's misogyny and victim blaming wrapped up in that, so that makes it even more difficult. But then there's sort of non-medicalised mental health support, so maybe counselling and therapy. Now, some women's organisations are funded to provide counselling and therapy, but never enough to meet demand. So it's just a really, I guess, another area where women's needs are not properly recognised and not properly, not properly met either. So yeah, it's really hard for women to get support, and it's I guess a bit of a postcode lottery. And if you're lucky in your area, an independent women's organisation will be funded to provide a decent level of counselling. But often that means going on a waiting list for a long time until there's a space available. And then if you're unlucky and your mental ill health is to the level that you are in distress and I suppose subject to a psychiatric what's the word I'm looking for, assessment, if you need that sort of support, then the ability to get that in as a medical model, but with the understanding of the impact of men's violence as part of that as well, to sort of treat it at both on both levels, then you're on a hiding to nowhere, really.
Yes. I've got a comment here from Sam J. I think I'll read this out for you, Sam. I had success as an admin assistant a decade ago at a charity that was advertising vacancies to support trafficked women. I simply said, female general occupational requirements. The HR director asked, could I do that? She just did not shortlist men. And Sam says, she said, yes. And the idea that an HR director didn't know that you could do that is baffling to me, but that's a really good point.
I think, though, just to sort of echo what Sam said, sometimes HR directors are the most risk-averse people out there. They don't want to do anything that might end up in litigation. So sometimes I do think, from a feminist perspective, you get really bad advice. And we do use the genuine occupational qualifications for every post that we can, and a lot of women's organisations do that. But we also know that Edinburgh, where Muriel Wadler got the job as CAO, they advertised that post as a women-only post and accepted him as a woman. Now, I don't think it's a lot of women says he lied to get that job. I'm not sure that that's actually the case, because I think he was well known enough in Scotland at that point, because he'd had jobs in other organisations. So I think it was fully, probably, this is my interpretation, but it was understood exactly who he was when he applied for that job. So they knew it's not that he lied. I think they knew he was a man and accepted that he was a woman.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Debbie has got a question. Debbie, are you able to answer your question? Unmute if you can. I'm looking back to see Debbie's question earlier in the session. Here we are. You work for Women's Aid. Okay, maybe not. Debbie worked for Women's Aid for many years when Labour was in government. They cut services for women, and says Thangam Debonair was the children's officer in WAFE in Bristol. And when
Women's Aid Federation.
Thanks. When she became an MP, she forgot about women and children then. And she says Labour are not a friend to women, regardless of what we're left to believe. So that's a particular experience that's obviously coloured Debbie's understanding.
Yeah. I don't know what I can say about Thangam. There's things that I know, but it's not my business to say them in a public forum.
Indeed.
But I think Thangam did have a better handle on women's rights than she's given credit for. And right. Personally, I think it's a shame that she lost the seat, but there you go.
Yeah. Louise has got a question as well about proposals. Louise, are you able to ask a question, or do you want me to ask it for you? Unmute if you can.
I could ask the question if I can remember all of it.
Okay.
It was along the lines of
enabling
it was-
women to retain homes.
yeah, it was along the lines of whether you're aware of any potential policy or any pressure or any campaigning with regards to women being allowed to keep family homes in terms of abusive relationships, rather than it being the women that always has to go to the refuge and the children.
Yeah, so I think that's always been recognised as a problem with the current provision, which in which women often do leave and go to refuge. I suppose injunctions are supposed to offer that, and I know that there are groups working to support that where it is possible, but it's not always possible, is it? Because one of the things we know is that if we know where a woman is and the family is, if she's in that home, then the man will know exactly how to find her and where to get to her and where the children are going to school. So for some women, that would be a vulnerability if because I'm of the mind that injunctions are a piece of paper, and men who beat women know what the law is, and a piece of paper that says that he's not allowed to beat her or threaten her anymore isn't going to make a jot of difference. So yeah, I know that there are there is work to make that more possible where it's appropriate, but I don't know the details of it because it's not something I'm involved with, and I like I said, it's appropriate in some cases, in not all, but it does. I recognise the injustice in the idea that a woman and a child have to leave the home, not the perpetrator, but I do think sometimes it's for safety reasons.
Yeah, right. Is that?
Thank you.
Yep. And Greta, you've got a question as well. We were talking about mental health services. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. I'm just trying to remember what it was. Yeah, it was whether Karen's got any ideas about those of us that do work in mental health services, what we can do to ensure we prioritise the needs of women, because as individual women in teams, yeah, we can have an influence, but on the culture and on the understanding of male violence, it's just a huge uphill task.
I think it's worth looking at work that the Iris project did with GPs, and that's a service that's about. So I know I'm going back to general health rather than mental health, but the work of Iris was to train GPs and all GP staff to better ask questions so that women could disclose domestic abuse, because what the research shows is that women who are experiencing domestic abuse don't go to the doctor and say, oh, I'm experiencing domestic abuse, what can you do? They go to the doctor and they're having sleeplessness, they've got depression, they've got anxiety, they've got gynecological problems, and those there's a whole list of I'm going to say 30, but it might be more than that, symptoms that are actually red flags for domestic abuse. So the Iris Project has trained doctors to not ask, are you experiencing domestic abuse, but ask a much more gentle question: how are things at home? Who do you live with? And tease out the information that way. So I think there's learning there for mental health services to ask those same sort of questions. I think routinely seeing women on their own without male partners there is important as well, so that you can ask those questions in a safe way. I think being able to give women information about where they can get support is the next part of that as well. If you were really, really lucky, you'd be able to resource somebody to provide that, I suppose, to do the signposting work and provide provide that stepping stone and be there to make sure the woman does access support. And then the other side of the coin for mental health, I think, is working with perpetrators, you know, the most seriously ill men who we know are violent. And I think when we look at risk assessments for those men, I don't think enough work is being done to look at the women in those men's life. Who are they living with, and which women might be at risk? Because when we look at men who kill their mothers, the level of schizophrenia, diagnosed schizophrenia in particular, but other forms of mental ill health and problematic substance use are really sky high. But you know, those men are not being risk assessed in terms of the risk they pose to the women in their lives. And I hinted at this when I was talking about older women as well, when often we're talking about men who have had failed relationships, and they've had to go back to their mum because their relationship has ended and they've got nowhere else to go. They might not have a job. And you know, the question we talked at the beginning about how difficult it is for a woman to leave an abusive man, but I do think that difficulty then has a different flavour if that abusive man is your own son. You know, to actually chuck your own son out of your home, knowing that you might be the last person that he has to go to, that also is really difficult. And that, you know, that's a recommendation that we've made as femicide services to mental health services, that risk to the women around these men who we know have histories of violence that are properly taken into account. So I went off a bit
I would
of a
have thought
tangent there.
I would have thought that forensic mental health services were better at that kind of thing. I'd hope anyway, you know, with men that have got a history of violence against women. But yeah, maybe you're right. They don't ask the right questions.
Yeah, and then if they're right, and if they do that, they're getting it wrong an awful lot. To say that, you know, 9% of all women killed by men are women killed by their sons, you know, that's I think there's systemic failure there, and if it's happening, then it's not doing what it's supposed to do.
No.
Okay, thanks. That was a really good question, Greta, and that's given us food for thought at any rate, hasn't it? I've got another question from Ilaria, who's got Italian connections, and she's asking how you would feel if somebody in Italy is keen to replicate what you've done in the femicide centres for Italian women.
I don't know if they still do it, but a bunch of Roman women in Rome were doing it at one point, because I met them.
Yeah.
Were they called Differenza Donna? Because I can't remember. But they I guess they were doing it their way, which is not necessarily my way. And I don't know if they've got an online presence and doing I guess doing the same things as the femicide census and counting dead women. But I think it'd be brilliant. What I would say is that there's a thing called the European Observatory on Femicide, and the femicide census is a partner with that, but from the UK perspective, and that's mainly a bunch of academics who are interested in femicide and collecting data for their country. Now there are a lot of differences, in fact, in the way that countries are doing that. But if you look, European Observatory on Femicide. If you Google that, you should be able to find different what's going on in other bits of Europe. We've just submitted a return to them for their next report, and I know Italy is definitely part of that. But if somebody wanted to set up an Italian counting dead women or an Italian femicide census, I think that'd be brilliant. But I'd check with the Roman women about whether they're still doing that.
Okay, I'll pass that on. That's great, thank you. Now
I'll check the name, Alison, and I'll talk to you about
Let me know
tomorrow or the day after. And then
that's ideal. But I think the European Observatory, that'll be a good place for them to have a look. The first thing. Now there's one or two more comments before we're getting towards the end. You and Jane is flagging up this brilliant film we've recently seen, Behind the Looking Glass, about the trans widows who've been tortured by their spouses because their spouses want to be the woman in the marriage. Good point, well made. It's a really brilliant, well made film, but it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Dion says HR are not necessarily up to scratch with equality, but generally lead on this in public sector particularly. And Greta, another comment here, really pertinent. Presumably all the health professionals who saw Giselle Pellico for 10 years definitely did not do IRIS project training.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, well, Giselle didn't know what was happening to her, even though she knew what the symptoms were. But that we also know that she's in France and IRIS is a UK
right.
But yeah, I mean, horrible.
It's the most amazing and horrifying story. And I think it involves her daughter as well. So it's a huge mess. But fortunately, she's got a very good solicitor, advocate, Antoine Camus. So she's getting some really great advice, and she's been tremendously brave. I think we need to give her respect for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you one last question myself. Towards the end of the book, in the fabulous chapter about Turf Island, you talk about Yasmin Alabai Brown decrying the proposal by a Muslim group for sex segregation in university lectures. I remember that. And you say that her opposition was that this endorses the most offensive prejudices about women. One of the critical questions, you say, is whether or not the single-sex space supports the participation of or discriminates against the oppressed group in public life or spaces. How best can we work out the benefits or the demerits of single-sex spaces? Whether they're helpful and whether they're not.
Yeah, the question is, what is the purpose of that single-sex space? And is it something that is to do with challenging and addressing sex inequality, in which case, great, or is it something that's about protecting sex inequality, which is usually the men's spaces and the keeping women out sort of ideas, in which case we challenge that and we break it down. So it's not one size fits all, is it? Sometimes we want single sex spaces, and sometimes we want to pull them apart. But I think as well, because there's been in the press this year, there was stuff around the Garrick, wasn't it? I think that's one of those posho clubs for highly influential actors and other people, and they just started letting women in without the presence of a man. And I've got such mixed feelings about that, because it's not, you yes, as a feminist, you instinctively want to pull down anywhere that excludes women because of sexism, but when it's all about status, in fact, even titles, title lords and ladies and whatever title, and it's primogeniture, isn't it? I from a social class perspective, I have very mixed feelings about that.
So I think men are entitled to single-sex spaces too, but it's less likely when there's power and privilege going on within those single-sex spaces, and women are barred from participating. I think that's the key point.
Yeah, and again, I mean, sport is another place that, isn't it, that we do, other than what we know is happening at the moment, we had got to a place where we did actually have single-sex sports because of the recognition of our biological differences, and so men didn't get single-sex sports to protect their precious little achievements and spaces. We got women's sports because we're physiologically different and couldn't compete with men. So men, but that's not the same as saying that the golf club is men only. And so when they're all round the bar that it's a little boys' club. It's a different thing, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. I think we've had a really great session tonight, Karen. Thank you very much. It's been so interesting to hear some of your stories and your experiences in this field, and we've benefited from your wealth of it. I'd like to thank Rachel for managing the event for Liberal Voice of Women. We do aim to put the talk up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. And also, thank you all for your great questions.